I was stirring the pot on the stove, letting the steam warm my face, thinking it would be just another quiet evening. You know that soft kind of calm that makes you feel safe in your own home? That's where I was, wrapped in the comfort of garlic, herbs, and routine. I kept glancing at the clock, waiting for Thomas the way I always did after work. Nothing felt unusual, nothing hinted at disaster. Yet somewhere deep inside, something small and uneasy pressed against my ribs, a feeling I chose to ignore. Then the doorbell rang, not loud, but sharp enough to cut straight through the room. I wiped my hands on a towel, still wearing that peaceful little smile you get when you're expecting someone you love. As I walked toward the door, something inside me hesitated for just a second, like a whisper of warning brushing my spine. I opened the door without thinking, just like I've done for deliveries, neighbors, anyone. But the moment the door swung open, I froze so completely that I swear even the air stopped moving around me. My breath caught before I even understood why. On my doorstep stood a pregnant woman, one hand resting on her belly as if shielding it from the world. Her eyes were red and swollen, the kind that come from hours of crying and trying to pull yourself together afterward. Her voice shook when she asked, "Are you Isabel?" And the softness of it hit me harder than any scream could have. I felt the warmth of the kitchen behind me and a strange cold rushing in from where she stood. In that instant, it felt like I was standing between the life I knew and the one about to fall apart. When she said her name was Lena, I felt the first crack run through my chest. It wasn't the loud, dramatic kind you see in movies. It was subtle, almost polite. The kind of pain that sneaks in and steals your breath before you even realize what's happening. I answered her the way anyone would, confused, guarded, trying to make sense of the moment. But her eyes held something I wasn't prepared for, something raw and terrified. I could hear her swallow hard before she spoke again, and that sound alone made my stomach twist. Every instinct in me screamed that whatever she was about to say would change everything. Then she told me Thomas had promised to explain everything today. I felt my fingers numb instantly, like my body understood the truth faster than my mind dared to. I asked her what she meant, but my voice came out faint, almost unrecognizable, as if it already knew it wouldn't like the answer. She took a deep breath, and her tears started falling, slow and heavy, landing like tiny blows on my heart. And when she said Thomas was the father of her baby, the words hit me like a punch I never saw coming. My knees weakened, my breath vanished, and suddenly the doorway felt too small to hold my world together. I stepped back, one hand reaching for my chest because the pain was too sudden, too sharp to control. "You're lying," I remember hearing myself say, but it sounded desperate, almost childlike. Because denial is the first shield we grab, even when it's cracked and useless. But Lena shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper as she told me he had promised to end things with me tonight. That sentence alone felt like a knife sliding under my ribs. In that moment, everything inside me began to crumble. My marriage, my certainty, my sense of reality. And yet, something deeper, quieter, had already begun to wake. I remember feeling the doorway tilt, like the entire house shifted beneath my feet, even though everything around me looked exactly the same. It's strange how your body reacts before your thoughts catch up. My hands were trembling, my throat tightening, my heartbeat loud enough to drown out her voice. I kept staring at her, at the shape of her belly, at the tears sliding down her cheeks, trying to understand how my life had led to this moment. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't cruel. She was broken, just like I was becoming. And somehow, that made everything hurt even more. I felt the floor disappear beneath what I thought I knew. My mind started racing through memories, late nights when Thomas said he was working, mornings he left early, days when he was distant, and I blamed it on stress. All those tiny red flags I folded neatly into excuses came crashing back, sharp and merciless. I felt stupid, blindsided, betrayed in a way that scraped at the very center of who I was. I could taste bitterness rising in my mouth, that horrible metallic flavor that comes with shock. And yet, underneath all that pain, another feeling pushed through, a cold, growing awareness that something inside me was shifting. I wasn't collapsing. I was waking up. Lena whispered an apology, but I barely heard it through the roar in my chest. I nodded, not because I accepted anything, but because my body needed to do something other than fall apart. When she stepped back from the door, I stayed there, gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping me upright. And in that fragile silence, I felt a strange clarity wash over me. Heavy, but steady, almost grounding. I didn't know what Thomas would walk into when he came home. I didn't know what version of myself he'd find waiting, but I could feel it already. Nothing about tonight would end the way he imagined. When Thomas finally walked through the door, humming and holding a bouquet of roses, it felt like watching someone stroll into a crime scene without realizing they were the main suspect. I stood there in the living room, still shaken, still holding pieces of myself that didn't fit together anymore. He smiled at me, that familiar, easy smile I had trusted for years, and for a split second my body reacted like it always did, softening, hoping, reaching. But my mind didn't follow, not this time. Something inside me had locked into place. He said, "Babe, I got roses," as if flowers could patch a hole blown straight through my life. I didn't move. I didn't touch them. My voice came out colder than I expected when I told him, "We had a visitor." I watched the color drain from his face, watched his body stiffen like he'd been hit by a freezing wave. He asked who it was, but he already knew. You could see it in the way his hands tightened around the stems, crushing petals without even realizing. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if every lie he'd told had finally come home to breathe beside us. When I said her name, Lena, it was like dropping a match into gasoline. He stuttered, begged, tried to reach for me with that trembling voice I used to run to. But I didn't step toward him this time. I watched him unravel instead, watched the truth climb up his throat like poison he could no longer swallow. My chest tightened, my pulse hammered, but I held my ground. Because for the first time that night, I wasn't the woman being blindsided at the door. I was the one demanding answers. When I bent down and picked up the roses he dropped, I felt the thorns prick my palm, sharp, unexpected, almost symbolic. It was strange how something so beautiful could hurt so easily, just like him. I let them fall to the floor, petals scattering like the last illusions I had left of our marriage. "Tell me the truth," I said, and even I was surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Inside, everything shook, but on the outside I felt carved from stone. He couldn't look at me. He stared at the floor like a child caught stealing, except what he stole was my life as I knew it. He whispered, "I made a mistake." And the words disgusted me so deeply I felt heat rise up my neck. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary, denting a car, burning dinner, not impregnating another woman while pretending to love your wife. I stepped closer, not out of softness, but out of fury. I told him exactly that, and watching his face crumble sent a wave through me I wasn't expecting, a mix of vindication and heartbreak. He kept stumbling over excuses, each one weaker, each one more insulting. And every syllable reminded me of the red flags I had tucked away to keep our life intact. When I shouted, "A mistake doesn't get pregnant," something inside me snapped in the cleanest, clearest way possible. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was revealing. He had nothing left to hide behind, no story left to twist, no version of events that could soften what he had done. He just stood there, hollow, with the truth finally choking him. And as I looked at him in that fragile, pathetic silence, I felt a shift inside me, a strange calm rising beneath the storm. It was the moment I realized this wasn't the end of the night. It was only the beginning of what I was about to become. I remember standing there, watching him collapse into silence, and feeling something inside me settle in a way I didn't expect. Not forgiveness, not understanding, just clarity. The kind that comes after a storm hits and you finally see what was rotting beneath the surface all along. My hands were still shaking, but my mind wasn't. I felt strangely detached, as if I were stepping out of the version of myself who waited for him every night. It hurt, yes, but underneath the pain there was a stillness forming, sharp and cold, like the start of a new instinct waking up. Thomas finally lifted his head, eyes glossy with fear, not of losing me, but of facing what he'd done. And that realization stung more than the betrayal itself. I watched his lips tremble as he tried to piece together another explanation, something to soften the blow, something to save him. But the words never came. Not because he didn't have lies left, but because he knew I wasn't accepting any. His shoulders sagged, his posture folded, and for the first time, I saw him not as my husband, but as a man cornered by his own choices. And it changed everything about the way I looked at him. As I stood in front of him, the room heavy with the perfume of crushed roses and broken trust, a quiet decision began forming in the back of my mind. It didn't roar. It didn't scream. It whispered, steady and unforgiving. I realized I wasn't going to fall apart the way he probably expected. I wasn't going to curl up, beg, or cling to what was already dead. No. I felt something sharper, something strategic rising inside me. And deep down, I knew this was only the first step toward a truth he never imagined I'd be strong enough to face. When Thomas finally tried to explain himself, something inside me had already shifted. I wasn't the trembling woman at the door anymore. I was someone quieter, sharper, almost frighteningly calm. His voice trembled as he talked about fixing things, as if our marriage were a cracked vase he could glue back together before anyone noticed. But I wasn't listening to his excuses. I was listening to the space between them, that empty space where the truth finally lived. And in that silence, I felt a different version of myself step forward, one who wasn't interested in tears or apologies. I walked past him without a word, the way someone walks out of a room filled with smoke, instinctively, urgently, knowing staying any longer would poison them. When I reached my home office, I opened the drawer I had once prayed I'd never need to. The folder was still there, exactly where I left it months ago, when suspicion had whispered against my ribs like a warning I tried to ignore. I felt a strange steadiness as I carried it back into the living room. Thomas watched me with wide, confused eyes, as if seeing me hold my own truth was more threatening than the affair itself. When I dropped the folder onto the table, the sound echoed through the room like a gavel. I watched his face drain of color as I opened it, laying out every piece I'd collected. Screenshots of messages I'd pretended not to notice, bank statements that told stories he thought I'd never read, hotel charges that smelled like cheap lies. And then the prenup clause, the one he had laughed off years ago, thinking it would never matter. I felt my heart beat slow as I looked at him, not in anger anymore, but in revelation. He had built this disaster with his own hands. I was simply holding up the mirror. Thomas's hand started shaking the moment he recognized the messages printed in black and white. It was almost surreal watching him confront his own words, the emojis, the hotel dates, the promises he made to her while I slept on the other side of our home. He kept whispering my name like it was some kind of shield, but it didn't work anymore. Not on me. Not after everything he'd done. I stood there, feeling strangely detached, like I was watching a man unravel from a safe distance. And in a way, I was, because emotionally, I had already stepped somewhere he could never follow. When I showed him the records of the money missing from our account, he looked at them as if he were seeing the theft for the first time. But I had seen it months ago, the quiet withdrawals, the excuses that didn't match the numbers, the sudden urgency he had to pay bills I had never heard of. Back then, I had tried to convince myself I was overthinking, that suspicion was worse than trust. But now, as he stared at the documents with his mouth half open, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my bones. It wasn't joy. It wasn't revenge. It was validation. The cruel kind, but the truest kind. When his eyes landed on the prenup clause, he actually went pale. Completely. His lips parted like he wanted to argue, to negotiate, to charm his way out of the trap he had built. But the words didn't come. They couldn't. Not when the paper spelled it out so cleanly. Infidelity meant everything was mine. Our home, our accounts, our life. Watching him fold under that realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel awake, fully awake for the first time in years. And while he sat there collapsing into fear, I felt something tighten inside me, a decision forming with a clarity he never expected from me. He finally found his voice, but it was barely more than a whimper as he whispered, "Where did you get all this?" The question almost made me laugh, not because any of it was funny, but because it showed exactly how little he had ever understood me. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the fear in his eyes not of losing me, but of losing everything he had taken for granted. "You lie, I listen," I told him, and the words tasted sharper than any scream. It felt like reclaiming something I had lost without noticing. My power, my perception, myself. And watching him shrink under that truth felt strangely necessary. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer without hesitation, the way someone pulls a fire alarm after watching the flames reach the ceiling. There was no guilt in my voice, no tremor, no doubt. Just purpose, pure and steady. I told her to prepare everything. Divorce filings, property transfers, asset protections, every step I needed to cut him out of the life he had poisoned. Thomas sank into a chair as he listened, his face twisting with disbelief, panic, and something else. Regret, maybe. But regret that arrives this late isn't regret. It's consequence. And I let him feel every inch of it. As I stood there holding the phone, I realized how shockingly calm I had become. Not cold, not numb, just clear. Like the moment after a storm when debris lies everywhere, but the sky has finally opened. He wasn't speaking anymore. He was just watching me, like he didn't recognize the woman he had underestimated for so long. And maybe he truly didn't, because the part of me that had begged for honesty was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly what she deserved. And deep inside, beneath all that steadiness, I felt the quiet beginning of something even he wouldn't see coming. The next morning, I woke up with a kind of clarity that didn't feel human. It felt surgical, sharp, precise. I moved through the house without trembling, without pausing, without letting myself fall into the softness of old habits. Thomas watched me like I was made of glass and gasoline, unsure if I would shatter or ignite. But I wasn't fragile, not anymore. I had a plan forming, steady as a heartbeat. And the first step was letting everyone who believed in him see the truth he had tried so hard to hide. When I told him I had invited his parents, his sister, and his closest friends for a family meeting, he looked like I had set a bomb on the dining table. His face drained of color, his voice cracking as he pleaded for me not to involve them. But this wasn't about vengeance. Not entirely. This was about accountability, something he had outrun for far too long. I watched him pace the room with shaking hands, rehearsing excuses he knew wouldn't survive the light of day. And honestly, it was the first time I realized how terrified he truly was of being seen for who he really was. As the doorbell rang and his family began walking in, confused, curious, unsuspecting, I felt a strange steadiness settle over me. Not confidence, not pride, just conviction. The kind that forms when you've been living in the dark for too long and finally find the switch. They greeted me warmly, unaware of the storm waiting in the living room. Thomas hovered behind me like a shadow begging to be spared. But this time, I wasn't protecting him. I was protecting myself, my truth, and even the woman he had betrayed us both with. And I knew the next steps would unravel everything he had built. When everyone finally gathered in the living room, the air felt thick, charged, expectant, like the quiet stretch before thunder breaks. They all looked at me with polite confusion, waiting for a birthday announcement or some family news. But Thomas stood off to the side, shaking his head subtly, silently begging me not to do this. His fear clung to the room like humidity. I could feel it brushing against my skin. And for a moment, I almost wondered how many times I'd cleaned up his messes without even realizing I was doing it. I took a deep breath and said, "Everyone, I want you to meet someone." And my voice didn't falter, not even once. When Lena stepped inside, her eyes lowered and her hands resting gently on her belly, the entire room shifted. His mother gasped first, the kind of gasp that carries both shock and disappointment. His sister clutched her chest. The silence that followed was almost physical, pressing against the walls. Thomas's face crumpled as if gravity itself had finally turned against him. And in that moment, I realized he had never expected to be held accountable in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to him. I explained what he had done, not with spite, not with theatrics, but with truth so clean and direct that it didn't need embellishment. The screenshots, the dates, the money, the betrayal that stretched across months, not moments. His mother stared at him through tears, asking, "Thomas, is this true?" And watching her heartbreak felt both devastating and strangely liberating. Because this wasn't just my story anymore. This was the truth finally dragging itself into daylight, where it belonged. And while he stumbled over half-formed excuses, I felt something shift inside me again, an even deeper certainty that this unveiling was only the beginning. As the room filled with shocked whispers and shattered illusions, I felt a strange calm settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, something quieter, heavier, almost solemn. I took my phone from the table and pressed play on the first recording, the one where Thomas told Lena he'd handle things soon. The sound echoed through the living room, bouncing off walls that had heard years of our laughter. Now they held something entirely different, truth stripped of every excuse. His friends stared at him with a mix of disbelief and disgust, and I could almost feel his world collapsing at their feet. One by one, I showed them the screenshots, the late-night messages, the hotel confirmations, the affectionate nicknames he had never used with me. Each image landed like a blow, not just to him, but to everyone who had trusted the man he pretended to be. His sister covered her mouth, shaking her head as she whispered, "How could you?" His mother looked at me with tears in her eyes, as if silently apologizing for something she didn't do. And all the while, Thomas stood there frozen, swallowing the reality he had tried so desperately to bury. I didn't need to say much. The evidence spoke louder than either of us ever could. By the time I added the financial statements to the table, his secret withdrawals, the hotel payments, the gifts he never brought home, the room felt colder, heavier, as if the truth had sucked all the warmth out of the air. He was no longer a husband or a son or a friend in their eyes. He was a stranger wearing a familiar face. And watching them see him clearly, maybe for the first time, stirred something deep inside me. Not triumph, clarity. A clarity so sharp it felt like the beginning of a new path unfolding beneath my feet, one he would never walk beside me on again. When the last family member finally left, the house felt unnervingly silent, like the pause after an explosion where the dust hasn't settled, but the damage is already visible. Thomas stood in the middle of the living room, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, not because I had diminished him, but because the truth had stripped him clean. And for the first time in all of this, He didn't try to explain, argue, or twist anything. He just stared at the floor, trembling, like a man who finally understood the weight of the world he had built on lies. That silence didn't comfort me. It clarified me. He whispered my name like a broken plea, stepping toward me with hands trembling as if reaching for the last piece of a life he knew he'd lost. "Please," he said, voice cracking in a way that might have shattered me months ago. But now, it felt distant, like listening to someone call me from underwater. I watched him kneel in front of me, desperation spilling out of him in waves. He begged me not to leave, swearing he'd do anything. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't fighting for love. He was fighting for the version of his life that kept him comfortable. That truth hit harder than his betrayal. When he said, "We can raise the baby together," something inside me recoiled so violently that I felt the air leave my lungs. It was a sentence so absurd, so tone-deaf, that I almost laughed. Not out of humor, out of disbelief that he could still misunderstand me so profoundly. I looked at him, really looked, and I saw a man grasping for solutions instead of accountability. A man who had confused my resilience for forgiveness. And in that moment, clarity washed through me again, steady and cold. I knew then that what came next had nothing to do with anger. It had everything to do with reclaiming my life. I walked past him and opened the drawer where I had placed the divorce papers earlier, my movements calm, almost methodical. There was no trembling left in me, no hesitation lingering in my bones, only certainty, solid and cold in a way I had never felt before. When I placed the papers in his hands, he stared at them as if they were written in a language he didn't understand. I could see the reality sinking in piece by piece. The house, the accounts, the security he had taken for granted. Every line he read drained another fragment of the man he pretended to be. "I'm not raising the consequences of your affair," I told him, and the words tasted like steel, sharp, final, undeniable. His face contorted, a mix of sorrow and panic that might have once moved me. But now, it only felt like a performance, a rehearsed desperation he used whenever he felt control slipping through his fingers. He tried reaching for my arm, but I stepped back before his hand could touch me. The distance between us felt symbolic, like the physical expression of a truth I had been avoiding for far too long. We weren't partners anymore. We hadn't been for a long time. He started begging again, louder this time, as if volume could replace honesty. But his words no longer penetrated me. I felt like I was watching him from behind glass, close enough to see every detail, but far enough to feel untouched by them. I told him he was leaving tonight, and the way his expression collapsed was almost surreal. He looked around the house as if searching for an anchor, something familiar to cling to. But everything around him had shifted. He wasn't looking at his home anymore. He was looking at the life he had just lost. He stood there holding the divorce papers like they were burning his hands, his eyes darting around the room as if reality might somehow rearrange itself. But nothing changed. Not the walls, not the silence, not the truth. I opened the front door without a single tremor, letting the cool night air spill into the hallway. It felt cleansing, almost symbolic, like the world outside was waiting for me, and all he had left was the echo of his own choices. He froze when he realized the door wasn't just open. It was for him, and this time, there was no invitation attached. I told him calmly and clearly that he would take care of the family he chose, not the one he broke. The look on his face in that moment, it was the kind of expression a person makes when they finally see the mirror they've avoided for years. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, carrying nothing but the weight of his own consequences. No suitcase, no memories. Nothing I was willing to let him keep. I watched his shoulders slump as he crossed the threshold, shrinking with every step he took away from the life he once called his. And oddly, I felt no anger, only release. When I closed the door, gently, intentionally, it felt like sealing something painful but necessary behind me. The house fell into silence again, but this time it didn't feel suffocating. It felt spacious, like the first deep breath after holding it far too long. I leaned against the door for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, letting it trace the edges of the new life forming inside my chest. There were no tears left, no shaking. Just a sense of freedom blooming in a place betrayal once lived. And as I stood there, surrounded by the stillness of my own home, I knew this ending was only the beginning of everything I was finally ready to claim.